Hi everybody, Tom Waters here with CreativeWatersArt, and I wanted to do a very short video to share with you some tips and some tools that I use for assessing values while I'm painting. I've only been painting for about 18 months, and like most artists that get started, you start out thinking a lot about color. But as I've painted more and as I've done more work, I've begun to pay a lot more attention to my values and the importance of values. And I think that's covered pretty well in a lot of places, but one of the things that I struggled with was having the tools, as somebody who's new, having the tools to be able to assess my values and get my values right. So I wanted to share with you what I've discovered over the last 18 months in case any of this is helpful to anybody else out there. And so I wanted to share with you some of the tips and some of the tools that I've started using in my painting to assess the values both in the subject and in the painting itself as I progress. As a quick review, as most of you probably already know, values is about the light and dark in a painting, the light and dark in a subject. And the most important part about knowing what your values are is the relative values between different aspects of what it is you're trying to capture, what you're trying to paint. And you've probably run across and seen out there on the web or in books or in class that a lot of people, that the standard tool for assessing values is to use a grayscale like this. This one happens to be a 9-step grayscale, and just a quick review, it's pretty simple to put together. I've seen these at 7 steps, I've seen these as high as 13 steps. I think 9 is probably the standard. It isn't important necessarily to have a lot of steps in between as it is to have a good distinction between the steps, because really what you're using this tool for is to assess the difference between different parts of your subject or your painting, the difference between values. So you want to know, if something is a 5 and something next to it needs to be a little bit lighter, is it a 4, is it somewhere in between, is it higher on the scale? And not all paintings run the full gamut from dark to light. You might have what's called a high key painting, which only uses the scale on the higher end, the brighter colors, or a low key where it uses it on the lower end, or anything in between. But putting one of these together is pretty simple. You start with black on one end, and that's your 9 scale, and then white on this end, and then in the middle of those two you mix up a value that's somewhere right in between. You put that in between, and then you mix up between your white and your middle value here to get this middle value, and between here and the dark to get this middle value, and then you just do the same thing between here and here to get this, here and here to get this, etc., to get a 9-step grayscale. And then how you can use that, you can see I've put punch holes in here. You can hold this up to a photograph, you can hold this up to a subject, you can use this when you're out in the field, or you can hold this up to a painting, and you can assess your values and say, okay, if you know that that your background needs to be a little bit lighter than your foreground, you can assess the values and see whether or not they're receding properly, or whether you've got it dark enough, light enough relative to what it is you're trying to paint. And that's all pretty straightforward, and I think most people are familiar with that. There's a variation that I ran across from this, or a different implementation of this that I think is really useful, and I ran across it on a website by the artist Brad Teare. You can find him on YouTube. He does videos, and he has a blog called the Thick Paint blog. I don't remember the exact address. I'll try to post it down below, but I think it's thickpaint.blogspot.com, but I'm not sure. But what he does is he takes that grayscale. Now what Brad Teare has done is he's taken that and he's cleverly put that, I think he might use a piece of glass. I have a piece of plastic here, but he's taken that same scale and he's put that on a piece of clear glass or plastic or acetate, so that he can put that right up and see his painting come through. And you get a little bit different effect if you're doing it with a strip like this versus if you put up this piece of plastic and you can see your painting come right through and narrow down exactly what your scales are. I'll pull this up a little bit closer and see if I can give you a better idea. Okay, so I'm not sure how well this is focusing, but you can see how you can take this and you can assess your values to try to see exactly what's coming through from the painting underneath, or the photograph, or whatever it is that you're trying to assess values for. Okay, so that works pretty well for grayscale images. Color images, it's a little bit harder, and one of the biggest challenges I found is that color really can influence my perception of the values. And I suspect and imagine that the more experience I get, the more painting I do, the more I'll be able to recognize those just by looking at them, looking at values. But as a beginning painter, you know, when I looked at something, a lot of times the saturation of the color, the hue of the color would definitely alter my perception of the values. So one tool that I've run across relatively recently, and I think it came from, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it came from maybe Will Kemp, the Will Kemp Art School. You can find that online. But he takes a piece of red plastic, red acetate. It's see-through, as you can see. And this comes, you can get this as sort of a wrapping paper. You can get this, sometimes you can find it as a folder protector or a book cover. But if you take, what's interesting is if you take something like this and you place it over a photograph, let's take this one at the top here, you can see that it quickly masks out a lot of the color. And so I'm going to bring this up close and see if I can't show this a little bit better. See that if you take this and you put this on top, it quickly masks out a lot of the color, darkens it for sure. But look how quickly you can see now clearly the darks and the lights as more of a uniform scale, more of a uniform tone. So it works really well with photographs. Again, taking away a lot of that color. And it's really interesting because if you look at this photograph right here, you can see that it seems like there's a big change in values in here with all these bright yellow stamens and the pink that surrounds. But if you use this trick and put that over, look how quickly most of that disappears. You can see the darks in here, but all that where there's color, that looks like there's a lot of value difference. A lot of that value difference is, a lot of that is actually very close in value, very uniform. And it can be really useful in that sometimes things show up unexpectedly. Here's a photograph that I've been considering for a possible painting. And one of the things I noticed when I put this, when I use this trick and put this over the top, like this, I'm not sure how well you can see on here, but look at the reflected light on the backs of these trees. Obviously there's a bright, high value along the front edge, sun's coming from here, but that reflected light on the back, I was surprised to find just how strong and how high a value that is. And had I gone to paint this without using this trick, I'm sure that I would have painted this as a much lower value and not gotten the values as correct as I should. So it can be surprising and a good use of the tool to sort of check your work, check your reference photos, or check your subject before you start to see what might jump out and stand out that you wouldn't have caught otherwise due to the color. Now, another way I've done that is I've just taken a piece of that and I've just mounted it in a piece of cardboard so that I can put it right up on top of something quickly and easily and have it in my pack. Where this doesn't work as well, but it still works, is if you're plein air painting, you're out in the field, and you're looking at your subject. If you hold it up, it doesn't work as well as a screen just to look through it as it does on a photograph. And I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it's a great tool for using with reference photos. Where I should have started actually is the simplest, easiest, and cheapest tool for assessing values is simply, and you've probably seen artists do this when they paint, simply to squint. When you're outside and you're looking at your subject, if you squint your eyes, it does a number of things that are really good. Not only does it allow you to see the composition as more shapes, it pulls away some of the detail when you squint, but also when you squint, it reduces down those shapes into more value relationships, so you can see the large masses of bright values versus dark values and sort of get an overall sense of that. And it also helps you by eliminating some of that detail. You can also see your edges better. So there's a lot of reasons why artists squint when they paint. Even stepping back from your painting as you're progressing and squinting at it and looking at it can be very helpful. So those are three really low-tech tools: squinting, using a value scale such as this, and then using this as a screen. A couple of high-tech tools, and even though they're high-tech, they're relatively available to everybody. One of them is to take a reference photo of what you're trying to paint, and reduce that to grayscale. So I happen to use Photoshop for my job, so I have Photoshop, but there's a lot of other photo editing tools. It's actually probably even some free photo manipulation tools on the web where you could take a photo and you could change it to black and white or to grayscale, desaturating the photo. By doing that, you can then eliminate, again, the effects of color. And it's really surprising. I'll try to show you some examples of how you can be influenced by color when the values are actually almost identical. One thing you'll find if you investigate online about the value of using a black and white filter versus desaturation versus grayscale is that they will produce different results. It turns out that the software algorithm that changes the photograph from color to black and white or desaturate or grayscale, the algorithms are different, and so you get different results. And there is no consensus I can find as to whether one's better than the other. If you have software that you have multiple options like black and white or desaturate, I say just try them and see which one you think looks more true to you, and then just stick with that. Because again, all you're really trying to do is be able to assess the values relative to each other. So as long as you're being consistent in the software that you're using to create a black and white version, then you should be able to do that effectively.
Okay, here's a PDF that was uploaded by a user at wetcanvas.com. He took this color chart, and here it is desaturated, the yellow desaturated. Compare that to turning it to black and white. So you see the difference you get in the different filters. Here it is in purple, full color, desaturated, and then black and white. So you can see you get different results. So just choose one and then stick with it is what I would suggest. If you take a look at strong colors, you know which value is stronger here. You'd be surprised perhaps to know that if I desaturate this, you really can't see any difference whatsoever. If I take that same color, red and green, and I do black and white, there's a little bit of difference in values, but not a great amount. Again, so here's the full color. What you don't want to do, this is turning it to grayscale, so avoid that because obviously it shifts it way too much. Now here's a photograph. If we take that in full color and then we try the different modes, a couple of different modes here I'm trying. The first one is to use a black and white filter. So you see this scale it gives you there. This is the black and white mode for the photo itself. So again, if you look at color, is desaturated black and white filter coming up, and then black and white mode.
And then the other high-tech tool actually is your smartphone or your camera. If you have one in the field, let's say you're plein air painting, and you're having you have a subject and you're having a little bit of trouble assessing what the value should be. Almost every camera you have, you can take a photo and take it in black and white. So just do that. Snap a photo, pull it up on your screen, take a look, zoom in, and you can assess your values there. You can do the same thing with a camera. So there you go. Those are a couple of the tools and tips that I've started to use when I start looking at my work and the value relationships, and I think it makes a huge difference to understand values and start to get those value relationships right in your work. It takes it to the next level. It takes it from just being a painting that's full of color to something that has a lot more harmony and is a lot more true to the subject. So give it a try, and I hope this was helpful, and happy painting.